It is the 31st of December 1999, the last day of the second millennium. People worldwide are worrying that the Y2K bug will knock out computer systems which are unprepared for the change from the year 1999 to 2000. But at midday from the Kremlin in Moscow, a very different news story erupts. The president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin, the first post-Soviet leader of the country, is stepping down early from his position. What is even more surprising is Yeltsin's plan for the succession. He is exiting office immediately and hands over power to one of his deputies, a 47-year-old ex-KGB agent who has swiftly risen from obscurity to the center of power in Russia. Within hours, Western media are describing Yeltsin's successor as the man from nowhere, as so little is known about him. But the world will soon come to know him very well. The man's name? Vladimir Putin, President of the Russian Federation.
The man, known to history as Vladimir Putin, was born on the 7th of October 1952 in what was then called the city of Leningrad, which has since reverted to being called Saint Petersburg, the capital of Russia under the Tsars between the 18th and 20th centuries. His full name is Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, a classic East Slavic name, and one which indicates that, unlike other modern leaders of Russia, like Joseph Stalin, a Georgian, Putin is a clear-cut Russian. His father was Vladimir Spiridonovich Putin, a middle-class Russian who had fought in the Great Patriotic War against Nazi Germany between 1941 and 1945, and otherwise was a factory worker. In short, he was a typical product of the Communist Revolution that had overthrown the Russian Empire in 1917. Vladimir's mother was Maria Ivanovna Putina. She and Vladimir Sr. had married many years before Vladimir Jr. was born. They had two sons early in their marriage, Albert and Viktor, but both had died in infancy or childhood. One claimed by disease, a second by the war in 1942. Viktor was not the only member of the wider Putin family who lost his life in the Second World War. So too did several of Vladimir's uncles and extended family members. It was some consolation to his parents, who had lost both their first two sons, that Vladimir arrived into the world in 1952 when Maria was in her early 40s and touching on the end of her childbearing years. More broadly, the Putin family was not involved directly in politics, although young Vladimir's grandfather on his father's side, Spiridon Putin, was a chef who had become a personal cook to Vladimir Lenin, the father of the Russian Revolution, all the way back in the early 1920s. He continued to work as a chef for the upper brass of the Soviet government, including Joseph Stalin, after Lenin's death in 1924, and was still involved in doing so, even during Vladimir's youth decades later. It is speculated that he was a member of the Russian secret services too, the NKVD, the forerunner of the KGB, which Vladimir would become a member of during his early adult life. Young Vladimir grew up in an era of extraordinary change in Eastern Europe. For centuries, this was the part of the continent that was most behind the rest of Europe from a socio-economic perspective. The Russian Empire in the 18th and 19th centuries was profoundly rural and thinly populated across vast swathes of it. A powerful government, aristocracy, and Orthodox Church exercised enormous influence over the lives of Russian people, such that serfdom, a form of medieval bonded labor, was not brought to an end in Russia until 1861, centuries after other parts of Europe. The Russian Revolution of 1917 and the rise of the Soviet Union had done little to change this situation in the immediate term. First, there was a period of catastrophic civil war and famine, down to the mid-1920s. Then, the Soviet policy of agricultural collectivization resulted in another brutal famine in 1932 and 1933. That was followed by the worst of the Stalinist terror in the second half of the 1930s. Then the Second World War. Then another famine after the war. And then the attempted reconstruction of a country that was left largely in ruins and where over 25 million people had died between 1941 and 1945. All of that changed in the 1950s and 1960s. Russia and the wider Soviet Union began to modernize and grow economically at an unprecedented rate. Studies vary, but most agree that Soviet economic growth was slightly over 7% on average throughout the 1950s, and similar rates were seen into the 1960s. This meant that the economy of the USSR, which Vladimir Putin was born into in 1952, had doubled in size by the second half of the 1960s when he entered his teenage years. Moreover, the society itself changed in the process, becoming much more modernized and with people having much greater access to modern technology and comforts. Furthermore, it was an era of national rebirth. After decades of Stalinist terror, war and famine, the Russian people were finally coming to hold a place of prominence in the world, and, for many years, it seemed they were winning the Cold War. It was against this backdrop of Cold War success and Soviet growth that Putin grew up. While their conditions improved over time, in the immediate term, the Putins' lives were tough in the 1950s. Vladimir Sr. had been injured in the war and suffered consequences from his wounds thereafter. They lived in a small apartment in a building where rats were a constant presence, as Leningrad was still being rebuilt years after the war ended. In this environment, Vladimir's wayward nature as a child emerged. He became part of a street gang that hung around the dvor or courtyards of the mass apartment blocks built by the Soviet regime for the new urban proletariat. Any extras in life here had to be fought for during his earliest years, and this quite possibly created a sense in him that life was a challenge in which everyone needed to fight to come out on top. That being said, there is absolutely no doubt that things improved for him as the Soviet state prospered. By 1960, he was attending a primary school in Leningrad. Then he headed on to high school, and he performed well enough here that he was sent on afterwards to study at a technological institute where he obtained a kind of high school diploma in chemistry, focusing on the study of magnets. He completed his training in this in 1970. Throughout his education, he was remarked on as being something of a troublemaker, yet at the same time, a reasonably intelligent and talented student. He also excelled at a few different sports. The details of Putin's life in the 1970s and 1980s are agreed upon in broad outline. After completing his secondary schooling and receiving his technical diploma, he went on to study at Leningrad State University. He studied law, specifically how legal and political issues overlapped with economic ones in international affairs, something which would later inform his career as leader of Russia. His 5 years at Leningrad State University were important for a variety of other reasons. He was required to join the Communist Party in order to study and progress there. More importantly, he formed a friendship with Anatoly Sobchak, a Russian legal scholar and later politician who would contribute to the formulation of the first post-communist Russian constitution in the early 1990s. They would influence each other's careers in different ways over the next quarter of a century. Putin must have been in contact with the KGB, the Russian secret services, and the Soviet analogue of the CIA by the time he finished his studies in 1975, as he almost immediately headed for the 401st KGB training school in Leningrad. His career over the next 10 years was one of gradual training, promotion, and a lot of desk work. He was inspired in all of this by his early years watching Soviet television shows like The Sword and the Shield that romanticized the idea of service to the communist state. He later reflected that he was, in a sense, the ideal product of the Soviet educational and vocational system. In 1985, his big break came when he was entering his mid-30s. He was finally given a major foreign posting. Putin was sent to the city of Dresden in the German Democratic Republic, better known as East Germany, the eastern flank of the Soviet area of communist dominance in Europe. Here, over several years, he would slowly watch the disintegration of the very system he had grown up in and lived within. When Putin was posted to Dresden in 1985, the Soviet Union was already in a very poor place politically and economically. The golden days of the 1950s and 1960s, when 7% GDP growth rates were standard and the Russians looked like they were winning the Cold War, were long over. The economy of the USSR had completely stagnated in the 1970s. This was not entirely unusual. The US-led Western system had its own severe problems during the 7 or 8 years after the onset of the 1973 oil crisis. But where the Americans, British, and others finally pulled themselves out of their gloomy scenario at the start of the 1980s, the Soviets remained on the same path. Furthermore, in Afghanistan, they were involved in a near-decade-long war that was the Russian equivalent of the US intervention in Vietnam 20 years earlier. To compound matters from the perspective of a KGB agent in East Germany, Mikhail Gorbachev had become the head of the USSR in 1985, promising reform and a more open discussion of political ideas. In the vassal states like East Germany, Poland, and Hungary, this basically caused the gradual erosion of Soviet rule. In Dresden, Putin and his colleagues were broadly confined to sending back reports to Leningrad and Moscow about how dire the situation was. Their worst suspicions were confirmed with the fall of the Berlin Wall on the 9th of November 1989 and the collapse of Soviet rule across Central and Eastern Europe. By 1990, the rot had spread to the USSR itself. Putin returned to a Russia in 1990, in which Gorbachev's efforts to reform the Soviet Union gave way to its collapse into 15 different countries in 1991. He would henceforth view these events as an historic aberration and formed the view that Russia needed to reconstitute its rule over these breakaway nations, which Putin perceived as lost provinces of a greater Russia. Gorbachev's rule did not survive the collapse of the Soviet Union. He had been outflanked in the chaotic politics of 1991 by Boris Yeltsin, a figure who had risen as head of the Soviet administration in Moscow in the mid-1980s and emerged as a charismatic though troubled leader in 1991. As the USSR collapsed and a new Russian Federation took its place, Yeltsin became its first leader. By then, Putin had long been back in Russia. His final years with the KGB in East Germany had been controversial. On the one hand, he was rumored to have had sympathies with anti-communist elements in the country. On the other, he had played an important role in either destroying KGB and Soviet records in East Germany that others did not want found once the Cold War ended, or bringing other tranches of records back to Russia. Back in Leningrad, which was soon renamed Saint Petersburg again, he renewed his acquaintance with Anatoly Sobchak, who became mayor of the city in the summer of 1991. Relying on his old mentor, Vladimir began a new career beyond the KGB, but still in service to the Russian government. For the next 5 years, he was essentially a rising mid-level official in St. Petersburg, charged with various tasks. His real ascent began in 1996, when he was transferred to Moscow and was given a senior role in the redistribution of state assets in post-communist Russia. No small post to be given at a time when one of the largest land and asset transfers in human history was taking place in post-Soviet Russia. Putin exploited his management of parts of this process to build political alliances. By then, there was clamoring to see who could succeed Yeltsin, a man whose already severe alcoholism had worsened even while ruling post-Soviet Russia. These early moves had put Putin in a very strong position. One could say that his rise was meteoric. He had returned from Germany as a middling KGB agent, and 7 years later he was wandering the corridors of power in Moscow and was emerging as a potential successor to Yeltsin. Thereafter, he accumulated more and more power. In 1997, he was made deputy chief of the presidential staff in Moscow. This might not sound like the most prestigious of titles, but chiefs of staff control access to the president or prime minister of a given country and can accumulate a lot of informal power while in a position of this kind. A year later, he was promoted to head up the FSB, the security agency that had succeeded the KGB. This was a logical place for Putin to acquire a position, given his past role in the KGB. But to move from being a former regional agent to being appointed as head of a security force, it's something else entirely. Finally, in 1999, he was named as one of 3 deputy prime ministers to Yeltsin. The first leader of post-Soviet Russia was nearing the end of his second term, and the appointment of these deputy prime ministers was a clear indication to all that they were possible heirs to Yeltsin. Not long after, Yeltsin endorsed Putin. Putin benefited from the fact that he had started to become omnipresent in Russian politics and society as the country recovered from the horrendous economic crisis and period of lawlessness that gripped the country after the collapse of the Soviet Union. In this light, he looked like a competent successor to the ailing Yeltsin, one who was guiding Russia out of crisis. In the presidential election of the 26th of March 2000, Putin won a comfortable victory over his main rival, the communist candidate Gennady Zyuganov. It might be hard to remember from the perspective of today, but Vladimir Putin entered office as president of the Russian Federation in 2000, viewed as a new species of Russian politician, a democratic leader who would modernize the country and then hand over power in due course, unlike so many oppressive Tsarist and communist rulers over the past several hundred years in Russia. And there's no doubt that he was not an all-powerful individual at first. There were constitutional limits on his power, and he had to monopolize full control over the government through a period of many years. What he did do is cement the power of the oligarchs, those individuals who had become immensely wealthy in the 1990s by acquiring huge tranches of national land, industry, and wealth as Russia was being denationalized after communist rule. Putin would eventually ally with many of these oligarchs after a power struggle and thereafter use them to cement his control over the country. His first 2 terms as president, down to 2008, were characterized by many different developments, notably growing tensions in the Caucasus, to which we will return very shortly, and also a series of major terrorist incidents like the Beslan school hostage crisis of September 2004, several of which were directly related to tensions in the Caucasus. More broadly, on the national stage, Putin enjoyed good relations with many Western leaders, including US President George W. Bush and German Chancellor Angela Merkel. The view was that Russia was finally taking its rightful place amongst the post-Cold War Western liberal democracies of the world. The period between 2008 and 2012 marked the real shift in Putin's position within Russia and international politics. The constitution that was produced for the new Russian Federation at the start of the 1990s mirrored the US Constitution in a number of different ways. One of the most notable was the constitutional block on any president serving more than 2 terms, a measure which had been traditional for much of US history and became a constitutional requirement following the passage of the 22nd Amendment after the Second World War. In Russia's case, Putin did not feel confident enough quite yet in 2008 to try to breach the 2-term limit. Instead, in the lead-up to the 2008 presidential elections, he began grooming his long-term political ally, Dmitry Medvedev, to succeed him. Medvedev duly won the election in an absolute landslide, taking over 7 in 10 votes. But it was a strange presidency which followed. Putin became Prime Minister, the second most important political office in the Russian Federation, and while many people viewed Medvedev as a more liberal reformer, it became evident over time that Putin continued to call the shots within government to an alarming degree. Unsurprisingly, as the 2012 presidential elections neared, Putin announced his intention to run again. With nearly 2/3 of the vote in the eventual election, he retook the reins of power from Medvedev. Although he was now breaching the spirit of the Russian constitution to a great degree, he became president for a 3rd term in 2012. He has never relinquished power since his takeover of Russian society was completed by the early 2010s, as he brought a renewed sense of national vigor to Russia. However, it must be remembered that he was widely popular too in Russia by the time he was allowed to begin riding roughshod over a Russian constitution that was only in its infancy. The quarter of a century that Putin has been in power in Russia has been one of almost perpetual war. The clash with Ukraine has caught the world's attention, but there has almost never been a time when Putin or Medvedev, as his stooge, was not at war in one region or another, primarily in the Caucasus, where, as we will see, he has effectively tried to reassert Russian control over the region south towards Armenia. This raises questions as to what Putin's political ideology actually is. After all, there are signs that he was not exactly the most committed of communist agents in East Germany towards the end of the Cold War, and he certainly shrugged off the Soviet era pretty quickly. And yet his wars have all been aimed at reacquiring lands which the USSR lost when it collapsed in the early 1990s, whether in Georgia, Ukraine, or his de facto creation of a vassal state of Alexander Lukashenko's Belarus. It could be said that this isn't a man trying to rebuild the USSR, though. Instead, he is determined to reconstitute the empire of the Tsars in the 19th century, when strong rulers like Alexander I and Alexander II played major roles in European affairs. It is well known that Putin reveres and models himself on Peter the Great, the figure who transformed Russia from a peripheral power in Europe at the end of the 17th century and the beginning of the 18th by defeating the Swedes in the Great Northern War, acquiring access to the Baltic Sea, and beginning the construction of Saint Petersburg. Putin sees himself as asserting Russia's rightful position on the world stage after a period of national humiliation in the 1990s, in much the same way that Peter inaugurated 2 centuries in which Russia moved from being a backwater in the East to become one of Europe's emergent great powers. There were minor skirmishes and clashes between the Russian government and various Caucasian groups for lots of border territories of a rather minor nature from the start of Putin's reign. Some of these had even started in the 1990s under Yeltsin. In addition, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan have been at war periodically with each other here for decades, all signs of what can go wrong when new states are formed chaotically, as in 1991. Putin adopted a much more militant approach, though, in 2008. He wanted to conquer Georgia, the most northerly of the large states of the Caucasus, and one which would extend Russian power over the eastern Black Sea. Relations had been deteriorating for years as more pro-Western governments came to power. A particular point of contention was the status of border territories like Abkhazia and South Ossetia. As separatist tensions and violence escalated, Russia and Georgia went to war in August 2008. The conflict was a short one. Georgia is a very small country, and even facing the inefficiencies of the Russian military, its towns and cities were being overrun within days. Foreign powers, most notably France under President Nicolas Sarkozy, stepped in to broker a ceasefire. In the negotiations, it was agreed that two major provinces in Georgia, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, would effectively become autonomous provinces or regions. Nobody should be fooled. This was a means whereby Russia obtained control over these parts of Georgia through a brief war. To this day, the myth of the quasi-independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia is maintained, but they are, in reality, Russian provinces. A similar dispensation had been arrived at in neighboring Chechnya at the end of the long-running Second Chechen War, after Putin installed Ramzan Kadyrov to run the region on Russia's behalf. Putin continues to try to interfere in Georgian politics, to try to bring the whole country under Russian influence, and it is evident that he wishes to make the Caucasus region an area of Russian hegemony in totality. While these wars in the North Caucasus in the 2000s were proceeding, Putin was building up a vast array of power in other ways. Although it is power which he covets above everything, he is also immensely wealthy. Although on a nominal salary of between $100,000 and $150,000 a year at various times over the years, it is speculated that, owing to mass embezzlement and acquisition of state property and assets, that Putin might in fact be one of the richest people on earth. It is impossible to tell. He certainly has acquired billions in assets over a quarter of a century at the helm of the Russian state. For instance, he is the owner of a Black Sea holiday retreat, a common prerequisite of Russian leaders over the centuries, which is worth tens of millions of dollars. It is just one of scores of properties he owns. His means of getting around reportedly include a super yacht worth $500 million, a fleet of hundreds of luxury cars, as well as helicopters and planes. Of course, it is impossible to trace all of this. Many of his more luxurious properties and his super yacht are registered in other people's names, while Putin also likely has billions of dollars worth of rubles hidden away in foreign bank accounts to access in the unlikely event that he should ever be overthrown and is forced to flee into exile. For years, this wealth was shared with his wife, Lyudmila Shkrepnyeva, although they divorced in 2014. Putin had 2 children with her, both daughters, Maria and Katerina, neither of whom is particularly involved in Russian politics. There have been numerous stories about Putin's affairs, notably with Alina Kabayeva, a retired Russian gymnast and media personality who was born in 1983, 31 years after Vladimir. She has given birth to several sons since 2015 who are rumored to be the Russian leader's children, although these reports remain unconfirmed. One of the more idiosyncratic elements of Putin's time as Russian leader is the manner in which he dispenses with his enemies. All autocratic rulers try to remove their rivals for power from the scene. In many cases, trumped-up charges of corruption or incitement to violence are used to bring the individuals in question to trial and get rid of them in this way. This is not Putin's preferred method, however. Firstly, he has crushed opposition within Russia by placing his own supporters in positions of power all around the vast country. The oligarchs, those individuals who became immensely wealthy billionaires through the acquisition of state assets back in the 1990s, have been brought under control by making examples of some of them and by allowing others to prosper by supporting Putin. Obedience is promoted. Disobedience is punished. Government ministers are played off against one another and made into competitors for Putin's favor. When it comes to those who oppose Putin directly, a pattern has emerged where they often die from poisoning. Usually, nerve agents like Novichok are found to have been used in such cases. A notable example was the poisoning of Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia in England in March 2018. Skripal was a double agent who had turned to the British government. Alexei Navalny, Putin's foremost domestic opponent for many years, was poisoned while traveling by plane back to Russia in August 2020. As is well known, he chose to return home to Russia anyway after recovering in Germany. He was soon arrested, placed under confinement, and died in an Arctic prison in Russia on the 16th of February 2024. Part of the reason why Putin has become as enormously powerful in Russia as he has is to do with a certain amount of economic luck on his part. Leaders often build up their power based on coming into office at a time when the economy starts doing well, and they sustain themselves through economic good times. Once people are doing well financially, they give more and more power to the leader. A striking example of this is the case of modern-day Venezuela. Hugo Chavez, as a socialist leader, was immensely popular and became a kind of model for Latin American left-wing politics during his period in power between 1999 and 2013. This was because his term in office coincided with huge oil revenues for Venezuela that created an economic boom. Conversely, as oil prices collapsed in the 2010s and the country was heavily sanctioned, his successor, Nicolas Maduro, had become one of the most reviled leaders in the world. Putin benefited from something very similar to Chavez. When he came to power in 2000, Russia had gone through a decade of economic and political crisis and national humiliation. All of that started to turn around in the late 1990s, and the first two terms of Putin's time as leader in the 2000s gave Russians a renewed sense of prosperity and pride. As this happened, Putin became hugely popular in Russia, particularly amongst the older generations, who suffered so much through the crises of the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. And as his popularity grew, there was less and less resistance to him monopolizing power and dismantling Russia's nascent democracy. One question that does need to be asked when it comes to Putin's power is whether he is someone who has shaped Russia's political culture or someone who is a symptom of it. All countries have political cultures, certain systems that develop over centuries that shape their politics and outlook. For instance, it is recognized that the Scandinavian countries have a certain political culture based around social democracy, and that this has been shaped by numerous socio-economic factors over hundreds of years. North Korea, with its closed borders and secrecy, might look like an aberration today, but consider that this is a country which was known as the Hermit Kingdom for centuries because of the way it closed itself off to outside influences between the 17th and 19th centuries. Russia is quite similar. While it has gone through different political systems, its political culture has remained quite similar over time, specifically one in which autocracy, the rule of a strong man and the use of state terror, have prevailed. For instance, it was in Russia that we find the first major example of a secret police in European history, the oprichniki, which appeared in the middle of the 16th century. For centuries thereafter, the Tsars ruled as autocratic rulers with immense power, centralized in either Moscow or Saint Petersburg over an otherwise enormous nation. Even when the Russian Revolution happened and communism was ushered in as a new form of political movement, the political culture of Russia remained the same in many ways. Joseph Stalin simply replaced the Tsars of old. Gorbachev had attempted to truly reform Russia's political culture in the late 1980s, but in the end, the country surrendered yet again to autocracy and the rule of a strongman when Putin arrived on the scene. In some ways, Putin is not an aberration. He is just a continuation of the exact kind of ruler that Russia's political culture has produced for hundreds of years. Putin continued his domestic takeover of Russia in a constant way in the 2010s after he once again returned to the office of president after his hiatus between 2008 and 2012. A lot of this was fairly everyday stuff. Russia was a society still in transition, and with such a vast population and geography, a lot of work needed to be done in the post-communist era to continue building up new institutions which would provide jobs, welfare, and law and order. Putin, for instance, promoted the development of larger cities and towns in Asian Russia east of the Ural Mountains, in part to begin expanding Russia's presence here after centuries of underdevelopment and in order to continue increasing oil and gas revenue. Cities like Yakutsk in the Siberia region have doubled in population since 2000. Putin has also quietly been working away on a long-term plan to ensure Russia is the dominant power in the Arctic in decades to come. On the international stage, he continued to play a role in world affairs, and despite the crackdown on opposition within Russia and his clear drift towards authoritarian rule, he was seen as a responsible partner of the G20 nations and other international groups for many years. European Union countries like Germany signed agreement after agreement to establish closer economic ties. Yet, at the same time, there were signs of a showdown between Russia and the West. The issue was Ukraine, the largest of the countries, along with Kazakhstan, which emerged independent of Russia at the end of the Cold War. Throughout the 1990s and most of the 2000s, Ukraine's leaders were distinctly pro-Russian and maintained close ties to Moscow. The country's politics were dominated in the early 21st century by Viktor Yanukovych. However, within Ukraine, there was a desire for closer cooperation with the West and to join the European Union. Ordinary Ukrainians looked on as former Soviet bloc countries like Poland, Estonia, and Lithuania benefited enormously from entry into the EU in 2004 and wanted to push for the same. This issue would transform international politics before long. The start of the Ukrainian conflict and Putin's descent to become a pariah-like leader in the eyes of Western governments began late in 2013 when Yanukovych, under pressure from Putin, moved to withdraw from an association agreement which had formerly been reached with the leaders of Western and Central Europe and which was clearly a precursor towards Ukraine becoming an EU member state one day. Putin viewed this as an encroachment into a traditional region of Russian influence and was also concerned about the eastward expansion of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization right up to Russia's borders since the end of the Cold War. The renunciation of the association agreement led to mass protests in Ukraine. Yanukovych was eventually forced to flee the country and headed into exile in Russia. Putin responded by launching a war of aggression against Ukraine. Within days, Russian troops were moving into the Crimean Peninsula and occupying it in early March. On the 18th of the month, Putin signed a treaty in Moscow alongside pro-Russian Crimean leaders, which allowed for Crimean entry into the Russian Federation. The Russian leader was also beginning a campaign right out of the Georgian playbook of 2008. Russian troops and resources were being sent into eastern Ukraine to regions like Donetsk and Luhansk, with the ostensible goal of supporting pro-Russian separatists there, just as Putin had in South Ossetia and Abkhazia 6 years earlier. This was the beginning of the long war that is still running between Russia and Ukraine. To most observers today, It might appear as though the war between Putin's Russia and Ukraine only began in February 2022. There is a reason for this. Putin wished to make it look for several years as though he was simply offering support to regional separatists in eastern Ukraine who wanted to establish breakaway states in the Donbas region of Donetsk and Luhansk. Crimea had been effectively annexed by Russia already. Putin could argue that the people of eastern Ukraine were ethnically Russian, spoke Russian, and wanted to remain independent of any new Ukraine that was forging closer ties to the West. There was little or no extension of this regional conflict into the rest of Ukraine, and there certainly were no attempts by Russia to try to seize the city of Kyiv. Putin did also engage in the Minsk negotiations in Belarus from 2014 onwards, where there were efforts to find a lasting solution to the crisis, which had begun in Ukraine months earlier. For instance, the Minsk I and Minsk II protocols were signed in 2014 and 2015 respectively. Key questions surrounded the position of Donetsk and Luhansk. It shouldn't be forgotten how effective these talks were. Ceasefires were periodically agreed, and while no lasting peace conditions were agreed upon, they did prevent the further extension of the war. There were even times when it looked like a major breakthrough could result in lasting peace terms. The question of whether Putin was acting faithfully in these negotiations or was simply biding his time for the expansion of the war with Ukraine will remain a question of intense debate for many years to come, particularly once the war between Ukraine and Russia finally comes to an end. The shift in the situation in Eastern Europe came in the early 2020s in response to a very specific matter: the issue of Ukraine's entry into NATO. At the end of the Cold War, NATO had immediately moved eastwards when Germany reunified. Then it enlarged in two huge expansions in 1999 and 2004 that brought in countries like Hungary, Poland, Romania, the Baltic states, and Bulgaria. This was always viewed with a certain amount of displeasure in Moscow. There had been no agreement on NATO expansion reached at the end of the Cold War. The view was that with the Cold War over, the alliance had served its purpose. But as it crept eastwards towards Russia in the late 1990s and 2000s, many people were unsettled by this. Ukraine had opted to abandon talks to join under Yanukovych. Now, post-2014, with Russia fighting a regional war against it in the Donbas, the Ukrainian government re-entered talks with NATO. It enshrined the goal of joining NATO into the national constitution in 2018, and talks accelerated in the years that followed. While nothing could justify the war which would follow, it is evident that Putin and others in Moscow did actually view this as an act of provocation, one which would see NATO expand to the Sea of Azov and right up to Russia's borders in the southwest of the country. Regardless, it provided the excuse that Putin needed to expand his war in Ukraine. In a long speech which he gave in Moscow in February 2022, he presented an historical interpretation of Russia's claims to Ukraine and effectively suggested that there was no such thing as a Ukrainian state from a historical perspective, that it should rather be seen as a Russian province. This long-running speech ran back to the 18th century and once again demonstrates his view of himself as a ruler of Russia who is reconstituting the empire and power of the Russian state as it existed in centuries gone by. This done, after months of military build-up along the borders, he ordered a full-scale invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022. Hundreds of thousands of troops streamed into the country, the goal being to win a short, sharp war. Putin had obviously prepared for many years for the extension of the war in Ukraine. At the very center of this strategy was the sheer act of making the rest of Europe enormously reliant on Russian gas and oil to power its industries. In particular, the manner in which Germany, one of the world's largest industrial economies, became reliant on Russian gas to power its factories and to produce the cars, electronics and other products that are the economic engine of the economy of the European Union, was extraordinary. It meant that when Putin began moving his soldiers in vast numbers to the borders of Ukraine in the winter of 2021 and into early 2022, Europe's nations looked on aware that they were now facing an economic catastrophe, one which had been timed to coincide with the COVID-19 pandemic, a global health crisis which had already just necessitated Western governments spending trillions of euros, pounds and dollars on support measures. Any effort to try to undermine Russia's attack on Ukraine would now necessitate trying to wean Europe off its reliance on Russian gas, even as a huge inflation crisis was beginning. Putin was perfectly aware of this, and must have been planning it for most of his time as leader of Russia. It had begun to reach fulfillment after the completion of the Nord Stream 1 gas pipeline between Russia and Germany, all the way back in 2011, and since then, Europe had only become more and more reliant on cheap Russian gas. Now, Putin believed he would simply reroute Russia's gas and oil to other countries. Global oil and gas prices would skyrocket, which they did, allowing him to finance a fast and effective war. Within weeks, he would be in Kyiv, and Russia would be on its way to reconstituting the empire of the Tsars of old that he so greatly admired. But while Putin's energy policy had run rings around Europe, he was to be proved incorrect about the resilience of the Ukrainian people and also the performance of the Russian military, which was much poorer than expected. Putin could arguably be described as a product of a certain type of Russian political culture, and just as countries have political cultures that last over centuries and over changes of government, they also have military cultures that often persist through changes of regime, time and technology. Russia is again an interesting case study in this respect. Although the Red Army won the Second World War against Nazi Germany in Europe, it lost nearly 10 men for every German killed. Russia performed terribly during the 20th century in wars against powers like Japan, Finland, and the Afghan rebels in the 1980s. It has a long-standing history of underperforming and being poorly led. The Ukrainian invasion of 2022 was no different. The idea was to quickly capture Kyiv and also overrun the eastern parts of the country, uniting Donetsk and Luhansk to the Crimean Peninsula along the northern or western end of the Sea of Azov. Further campaigns would soon follow to move forward to the Dnieper River from the east, and eventually, a few months into the war, the Russians doubtlessly intended to try to take the important Black Sea port of Odessa, followed by the western capital Lviv. All going well, Putin probably imagined he would be celebrating a military parade in Kyiv within a few months, while the European Union was still trying to figure out what to do about its compromised energy situation. This is not what happened. The Russian armed forces met with much stiffer resistance than they had expected. The Ukrainians were buoyed by years of Western military training and a lot of advanced military hardware, which the US, Britain, France, and others were able to supply without intervening directly. The attack on Kyiv was repulsed after a series of successful counterattacks in late March 2022, and the war in the east became much more attritional than had been expected. The war in Ukraine since those first few months has rarely been out of the international news. A key early moment was the siege of the city of Mariupol and its sprawling ironworks between February and May 2022. This is located on the northern shore of the Sea of Azov and points towards one of Putin's key goals as the war developed in these months, to create an unbroken line of control between Donetsk and Luhansk and the Crimean Peninsula. News of atrocities like mass executions and torture abounded as the war went on. notably the murder of 458 people in the town of Bucha in March 2022. Putin has consequently become identified not just as a despot and inciter of Europe's worst war since the Second World War, he is now viewed as a war criminal too. The war moved over and back thereafter. For instance, in 2023, with US and European support flowing into the country and Russia's military leadership providing very poor oversight of the war, the Ukrainians seem to be gaining the upper hand at times and reclaimed a number of territories that had been lost in 2022. Putin resorted to emptying out Russian jails and offering prisoners amnesties for periods of service in the war, while he would eventually turn to his ally, North Korea, to send thousands of troops to fight in Ukraine. This was nowhere near the easy victory he had planned on. The one saving grace for Putin was that, far from crippling the Russian economy, the war had actually led to a Russian economic boom in the short term, as gas and oil prices increased dramatically and the shift towards a war economy created a lot of new employment. On the other side, the war has had extremely personally disadvantageous implications for Putin himself. In 1997, Russia had been invited to join what became the G8 group of the world's leading economies. As leader of Russia for most of the period from 2000 onwards, Putin had regularly attended these important international summits, but the annexation of the Crimea in 2014 led to Russia's suspension from the G8 that year, one of the few genuinely punitive measures taken by Western nations at that time. This was compounded in March 2023 when the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Putin based on crimes committed by the Russian state in Ukraine since February 2022, most notably the illegal deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia since the expansion of the war. The arrest warrant has severely limited Putin's international movements ever since. Inevitably, over a period of time, as the war failed to result in the swift and easy victory Putin had promised his own people against what he continued to represent as a Nazi-controlled government in Kyiv, opposition has emerged in some spheres within Russia. Most of this was easily crushed, and a lot of individuals who spoke out against the conflict sadly disappeared into jails to serve draconian sentences for expressing mild anti-war sentiments. But Putin faced one major test of his leadership. Years earlier, Yevgeny Prigozhin, a peculiar Russian figure who started life as an opportunist jack-of-all-trades businessman and restaurateur in Russia in the 1990s, had set up the Wagner mercenary group in Russia. It had played an important role in Russian foreign interventions in Syria and several Sahel countries like Mali and Niger in recent years. As the war in Ukraine was expanded, the Wagner Group was expanded further until it constituted a small army in and of itself. Prigozhin also became more and more critical of how the government was conducting the war effort. On the 23rd of June 2023, he launched a de facto revolt against Putin when he took over the city of Rostov-on-Don, and then sent a substantial force north, speedily towards Moscow. Putin appeared on live television to denounce these actions. There was no doubt from the footage that the Russian leader was extremely phased and looked worried about developments, even as forces which remained loyal to him were setting up roadblocks around Moscow. In the end, Prigozhin bizarrely called off his revolt and was duly killed in an airplane incident 2 months later. Nevertheless, the very brief Prigozhin revolt showed that Putin was not entirely invulnerable. The war continues in Eastern Europe. Despite efforts by the Ukrainians to launch counterattacks into the Kursk region of Russia itself and a strikingly high death toll on the Russian side, time will tell whether the Russians will be able to overpower the Ukrainians or whether heavy losses will result in a Russian defeat. it has managed to acquire further territory, solidify its rule over some other regions, and is escalating its punitive attacks on civilian targets in places like Kyiv and Odessa. The biggest development has been the election of Donald Trump in the United States and the arrival into power of a Republican government which argues that the Ukrainian war is not its problem to solve or pay for. As such, US aid in the form of advanced military hardware to the Ukrainians has collapsed, and the European Union and Britain have had to drastically increase their own direct support to Ukraine in response. Peace negotiations have taken place in Riyadh, Istanbul, and elsewhere, but despite some symbolic prisoner swaps in the summer of 2025, there seems to be little concrete on the table as yet, and the Russians have been criticized for failing to send top-level diplomats to some of these gatherings. Whether admitted or not, both sides are aware that Ukraine will have to make large-scale land concessions in the east in the shape of the Crimean Peninsula, Donetsk and Luhansk. But these are regions Russia has broadly controlled since 2014 anyway. The thornier issue will probably prove to be NATO membership or the presence of a European peacekeeping force in Ukraine. Regardless, Vladimir Putin has certainly not achieved all of the war aims he started out with in Ukraine many years ago. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian leader, Volodymyr Zelensky, is maintaining a tough stance on not making concessions to Putin and Russia, suggesting the path to peace may be longer than most would hope for. As things stand in the mid-2020s, there are many questions as to what Vladimir Putin's ultimate motives are, and whether or not he will continue to try to expand Russia's power beyond the regions where he has already intervened. It is entirely plausible that he will continue to try to do so. For instance, Russia's ultimate goal is to dominate the Caucasus region entirely, perhaps establishing Azerbaijan as a semi-independent ally in the region in much the same way that Belarus retains a formal autonomy from Russia in Eastern Europe, even while effectively being a vassal of Russia. It is also clear that Russian intelligence and counterintelligence networks will continue to try to destabilize parts of Eastern Europe and the Balkans that have been long-standing spheres of Russian influence going back to the 19th century, notably Romania and Moldova, while it also continues to find strong support from governments in Hungary, Serbia, and other former communist nations. It is plausible to imagine a situation in a destabilized world where Putin might even attempt to grab a small amount of border territory from a country like Finland or Estonia if the world was otherwise distracted by something like a Chinese invasion of Taiwan or some other larger geopolitical conflict. But many of the concerns that have been expressed in recent years about the possibility of Putin potentially trying to acquire Poland and all of the Baltic states are probably overblown. Any such action would lead to a massive reaction from Europe, regardless of whether or not any support was offered by the United States, and as the war in Ukraine has demonstrated, Russia's military capabilities are actually quite limited. Moreover, Russia's economy could not sustain such a fight. Its economy is minuscule when compared with the combined might of the European Union. Any attack further west would constitute an enormous military and political overstretch for Putin. Perhaps one of the most strange questions of all concerning Vladimir Putin is who might succeed him. He is 72 years old as of 2025 and is, by all accounts, a healthy individual, despite almost constant rumors of severe health conditions over the last 10 to 15 years, none of which have been substantiated. It is unclear exactly how many children he has. Regardless, none of these have been prepared in any way which seems to suggest they will become successors to his political power one day. Moreover, while various individuals have been suggested as potential heirs over the years, most notably Dmitry Medvedev, each of these men has been promoted and then demoted over the years, with Putin constantly making it clear that supreme power ultimately lies with him. Other powerful figures, like the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, are of a similar age or older than Putin himself. In any event, Putin might well be around for another 15 or 20 years. This opens the possibility of a divided succession, which would not be entirely dissimilar to what happened when Joseph Stalin died back in 1953. The communist dictator had spent so many years eradicating his enemies and removing anyone who could even remotely be construed as a threat that there was no clear line of succession when his reign of terror came to an end. In this environment, there was a succession crisis in the mid-1950s that eventually resulted in Nikita Khrushchev coming to power. But even then, the Soviet government was split for years between pro- and anti-Stalinist elements. Maybe, in years to come, a clear successor to Putin will emerge, but for now, it remains an open question. As of August 2025, Vladimir Putin remains effectively at war with much of the Western world. This is through a proxy conflict in Ukraine, but the many rounds of international sanctions on Putin by the United States and the European Union, as well as the limitations on his movement, point towards a kind of indirect shadow war with the West. Admittedly, this has been altered by the entry into office of Donald Trump and the watered-down support which his administration has offered to Ukraine. This oscillates almost from week to week at the same time and points towards the complex dynamics of the relationship between Donald Trump and Putin. Trump has occasionally expressed admiration for Putin in the past and has frequently referred to productive engagements with the Russian leader on possible peace negotiations. This can then quickly be followed by declarations by Trump on his social media entity, Truth Social, that he is becoming deeply annoyed with Putin's stalling tactics when it comes to advancing any peace process. There has been a lot of commentary by the media on this peculiar relationship and what it might say about Trump's ties to Russia going back to his business dealings there in the 1990s. At the time of writing, in mid-August 2025, the two leaders are scheduled for a summit in Alaska, a kind of pseudo-neutral ground, as it was once a Russian colony before it was sold to the US in 1867. Whether this will lead to any meaningful change in the Russo-Ukrainian war is debatable. Many commentators remain skeptical and believe that Putin will seek to delay further while perhaps holding out a carrot of a few concessions that Trump will be able to present to the international media as progress towards peace. Nobody can be sure. Meanwhile, the killing continues in eastern Ukraine, and Russian drone attacks on Kyiv and other civilian centers away from the front lines have escalated considerably on Putin's orders since the spring of 2025. Few individuals have impacted more substantially on the history of the early 21st century than has Vladimir Putin. His rise was meteoric and unexpected. A former middling KGB agent with a so-so record of service in East Germany in the last years of the Cold War, he arrived back to Russia as the Soviet Union was collapsing and used his personal connections to acquire a position within the government of Saint Petersburg. Over the next few years, he rose gradually there and then was transferred to the central government in Moscow in 1996. During the final 4 years of the rule of the ailing Boris Yeltsin, he proved his political skill, acquiring control over elements of land and asset redistribution and over the secret services. Through all of this, he built up a power base which meant he was viewed as a potential successor to Yeltsin by 1998. That's exactly what happened 2 years later. Putin's power was not absolute at first. The very fact that he handed over power to Dmitry Medvedev, at least in a tokenistic manner in 2008, shows that he was not yet confident enough to claim absolute control over the Russian Federation. In the 2010s, that all changed. His life's work, as he sees it, is to try to reacquire as much of the power and land which Russia had lost at the end of the Cold War as possible. To that end, he has engaged in numerous wars in the Caucasus, primarily with Georgia, and has made Belarus a virtual vassal of Russia. The most brazen act of aggression, though, has been his piecemeal invasions of Ukraine since 2014 and the extension thereof in February 2022. Using a plan whereby he made Europe wholly reliant on Russian gas over several decades, he hoped to win a quick war. He failed in that goal, and it is doubtful he will attempt further major expansion in Eastern Europe in the near future. With no fixed heir, and the possibility of him living and ruling for another 20 or so years, the future of Russia and Eastern Europe remain extremely unstable as a result of his rise in the early 21st century. What do you think of Vladimir Putin? Is he just the latest manifestation of Russia's continuing stream of autocratic rulers? Or could modern Russia have turned out very differently if Gorbachev's vision of a liberal and forward-looking Russia had been realized? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.